Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world watching us. I'm Mike Sprague. I'm the director of the Polar Institute and the Global Risk and Resilience Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And we have over 600 of our colleagues around the world joining us today. We're very pleased about that. And this program is entitled The Arctic in a Post-Election World. This is the first of a two-part series of discussions. Today's program is focused on how experts outside of the United States view the impacts and implications of the Biden administration on the Arctic region. The second program, which will happen in 2021, early in 2021, will be focused on the US with US experts giving us US perspectives on the very same title of this conference. As always, I want to thank the leadership of A2A Railway and Ogunit Corporation from the village of Wainwright, Alaska, for their vital and continued support of the Polar Institute. Without this support, we couldn't do the work or bring to you programs like this. I'd also like to extend my appreciation to our Wilson Center colleagues at the Kennan Institute for their support, as well as our colleagues at the University of the Arctic. Before we start today, I want to provide some context for the discussion. In recent years, as we all know, the Arctic has become the focus of increasing activity and attention due to a wide range of environmental, political, economic, and security factors. A US administration under the leadership of President-elect Joe Biden, as well as potential changes to the composition of Congress, may have profound consequences for US policy and, as a result, for America's relationship with both Arctic and non-Arctic states. So today, we have asked our panel of experts to explore the following questions. How might US Arctic policy and posture change as a result of the US election? And how are these potential changes viewed from abroad? We pose these questions because the Arctic is a consequential component of the broader political landscape we now must navigate. And because we know what happens in one part of the Arctic impacts many, if not all, other parts of the Arctic. What happens in one country in the Arctic impacts many, if not all, other countries in the Arctic. Decisions made by one government or one council or one organization more likely than not impacts other governments and other councils and other organizations because we live in a global Arctic. In so many ways, our Arctic is interconnected, interrelated, intertwined, interdependent, interreliant. And although we now live in a globalized Arctic, it remains at once a big neighborhood and a small community. So the new dynamic, the new Arctic presents many challenges impacting a shared landscape, a shared environment, shared ways of life and cultures that have endured and thrived for millennia. Yet change also presents opportunity and promise. Likewise, and communities drive economic development. They can enhance communities, they can foster relationships and trade, or enhance international compositions of organizations, advance education, or healthcare. All of these realities, dynamics, themes, challenges, policies are informed, influenced, shaped, enabled, or even stifled by leadership at the local, regional, national, and international levels. All of this then to say, and to bring us back to the statement we started with, how might US Arctic policy and posture change as a result of the US election, and how are these changes viewed from abroad? It's now a pleasure to introduce to you our panel of experts. Each speaker will share opening comments, and then we will move to a roundtable discussion where we encourage you to advance this discussion by sending to us your questions for the panel at polar@wilsoncenter.org. Email us at polar@wilsoncenter.org. And now for the panel. It's a pleasure to introduce Ambassador David Bolton, who serves as a senior fellow at the Polar Institute. He also served as a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Oceans and Fisheries, and previously chaired the senior Arctic officials during the US chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Ambassador Bolton will provide insights from a US perspective. Dr. Andrei Todderoff, Research Fellow, Department for Disarmament and Conflict Resolution Studies at the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations, Russian Academy of Sciences. And he will provide insights from a Russian Federation perspective. Ambassador Marianne Conics. Now, she has had a distinguished European diplomatic career. She was the first EU ambassador at large for the Arctic, Previously, she was the EU ambassador to Canada, where she extensively visited the Canadian Arctic, and she also served as the EU ambassador to Mexico. And she has a big task ahead of her. She will provide insights from a European and EU perspective. Dr. Ulf Sverdrup. He is the director of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. He previously served as a professor at the Norwegian Business School BI, also served as head of the Secretariat for the official Norwegian Europe Review, which assessed the impacts and implications of Norway's agreement with the EU. And he will provide, also a big task, he'll provide insights from a Norwegian and broader Nordic region perspective. And finally, Dr. Heather Eckner-Perot, managing editor of the Arctic Yearbook. She's a board member of the Saskatchewan First Nations Economic Development Network, a board member of the Arctic Institute, and chair of the Canadian Northern Studies Trust. She will provide insights from a Canadian perspective. So, with that long introduction and some context, I would now virtually like to turn over the floor to my colleague, Ambassador Dave Bolton. Dave?
Mike, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Thanks to the Wilson Center for organizing this. So I will try to give my sense of what the change in the US administration might mean for US international relations in the Arctic. As Mike said, we hope to have another program early in 2021 to focus on sort of domestic issues. Because politics in the United States have gotten increasingly polarized, and because the US election is ushering in a president from a different party, there's a temptation, I think, to say that everything will change, including all US policy in the Arctic, or at least that most things will change. I think I'm going to resist that temptation. I think the reality is likely to be somewhat more complex and subtle, nuanced. And so what I'll offer in just a few minutes is my sense, at least, of what things actually will change, maybe a few things that may change, and then maybe one or two things that I think won't change. So starting with the things that will change. Well, one thing seems pretty clear to me, that US climate policy, both as it relates to the world as a whole, but including as it relates to the Arctic, will change. Incoming President-elect Biden has already announced the United States will rejoin the Paris Agreement and presumably will once again become one of the leaders in supporting efforts to combat climate change at the international level, also of course at home. And this will have some profound implications for our relations with other countries in the Arctic and other countries that care about the Arctic, because so much of what is happening in the Arctic relates, of course, to climate change. I would expect to see the United States pushing for steps to be taken in the Arctic to address problems of climate change, more aggressively than in the last 4 years. And I think we will find the United States more in alignment with at least most of the other countries on climate policy. Related to this, I think to the extent that issues in the Arctic, like elsewhere, sometimes involve trade-offs between resource development on the one hand and conservation or environmental protection on the other, I don't think there's going to be a complete sea change, but I do believe that the incoming Biden administration will focus more attention, more emphasis on conservation and environmental protection. And I think the United States will, both in the Arctic and elsewhere, place more emphasis on working through multilateral institutions and regimes like the Arctic Council. During the Trump administration, the United States famously sort of retreated, at least to a certain degree, from a number of those organizations, or refused to cooperate within them, including at the Arctic Council and at its ministerial meeting just last year. And so I think that in the Arctic, the US will promote efforts to strengthen the international governance regime for the Arctic, will strengthen ties with allies and partners in the Arctic, ties that have gotten, frankly, somewhat frayed in the last 4 years. That's what I think will change. There are a couple things that may change. It's not as clear to me, though. One has to do with relations with the Russian Federation in the Arctic. So until a few years ago, the United States and Russia chose to compartmentalize the Arctic, by which I mean they chose to set aside the differences they were experiencing on other issues and about other parts of the world, and find things to work on, mutual interests in the Arctic, and often co-led efforts, including through the Arctic Council, to strengthen what is international relations cooperation in the Arctic. In the last few years, that dynamic has changed rather significantly, and it may change back. It's not at all clear to me whether it will, but I think there's at least the possibility that the United States, Russia will once again choose to compartmentalize at least certain problems in the Arctic and once again seek things to do together. Similarly with China, at least vis-a-vis interest in the Arctic, the Biden administration may not view Chinese engagement in the Arctic in quite the same way as the outgoing Trump administration. For the Trump administration, so much of US foreign policy was seen through a sort of anti-Chinese lens. And some of that may be continuing, including in the South China Sea and on other issues. It's possible, though, in the Arctic, at least the tone and temperature will change, and the United States will be less aggressive in pushing back against Chinese interests in the Arctic. We'll see. I don't actually know. Here are a couple of things that I think won't change. To the extent that Russian military buildup in the Arctic and certain provocative actions that Russia has taken have caused concern, even alarm in the United States and in other countries in the West, I don't think the incoming Biden administration is going to react particularly differently to those types of things in the future. I think there will continue to be an effort by the United States, perhaps even more closely aligned with allies and partners in the Arctic, to prevent this type of, or at least to discourage this type of behavior on the part of Russia, and to hope to reestablish a kind of equilibrium on security issues. We'll see. But my sense is that the Biden administration is not going to change very much the basic approach. On a more positive note, I would say that in the last couple of years of the Trump administration, US engagement with Greenland has developed in some unusual ways. The US established a consulate in Nuuk and also has engaged with both the government of Greenland, the people of Greenland in some new ways. And I expect that to continue under the Biden administration. I don't think that will change appreciably. And it's a positive development, will not change. And one other thing before I sign off, there was an agreement that was started in the Arctic during the Obama years, was brought to fruition during the Trump years, and is going to presumably continue on into the Biden administration, has to do with fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean. It's one that's near and dear to my heart as I was involved in the negotiation of this agreement. And I believe that the Biden administration will continue to support this agreement, and once it enters into force, be an active participant in implementation of the agreement. So there you have it, some rough sketch of what will change, what may change, and what I think won't change, thanks to the incoming Biden administration. Mike?
Thank you, Dave, very much. A number of themes I'm sure we'll come back to, and I'm already seeing a number of questions coming in that follow some of your comments and then also predict other comments as well. So we'll loop back to that. Our next speaker, to carry out the theme, Andrei Todderoff. Andrei, let me offer to you the virtual floor for your opening comments.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this excellent panel. Maybe some of my thoughts will be similar to what Ambassador Bolton has already said, but nonetheless, I should say that there hasn't been much publicly available information on what Biden plans to do in the Arctic. Something could be drawn from Biden's plan for clean energy, and probably from some insights that Senator Murkowski shared publicly in October. And from what I read there, my vision of Biden's future policy in the Arctic is quite ambiguous when it comes to Russia. On the one hand, Biden is viewed as a successor of Obama in terms of focusing more on the environment. As Ambassador Bolton has mentioned, Biden is expected to reestablish climate change as a priority for the country. Commitment to multilateralism and willingness to cooperate with other states on tackling global challenges will, of course, bring USA closer to the other Arctic nations. In this sense, Russia could, of course, benefit from this revived US approach in the international organizations and fora that work in the Arctic, and primarily the Arctic Council. Russia will take over the chairmanship in the Council in May 2021, and though the program is still under consideration, some key priorities have been already established. It is known already that Russia will be committed to ensure continuity of the Arctic Council's traditional agenda and the program of the previous chair, Iceland. Therefore, the focus will be made on the sustainable development, mitigation of climate change, and environmental issues. The key topics for Russia will be finding ways to achieve green shipping in the Arctic, reinforcement of social dimension through enhanced support of indigenous peoples and local communities, increasing cooperation within the regional platforms that are closely related to the Council, such as the Arctic Coast Guard Forum and the Arctic Economic Council. So the success of this Russian program for a 2-year period would, of course, will much depend on the solidarity, on the shared vision of all the Council's members and permanent participants. So the support from the US as one of the key stakeholders in the region will, of course, be vitally important. We know how the Arctic Council could be vulnerable to political turbulence, and observed it in 2019 when the member states failed to come out with a final declaration on the ministerial meeting for the first time in the history of the Council. And I don't believe that such or similar situations will occur under Biden's administration. That was, I think, positive expectations. On the other hand, it seems that Biden will preserve the focus on national security in the Arctic. Geopolitical tensions with China and Russia will most probably continue. Some experts even believe that the focus could be shifted more on Russia, since USA have much more interdependency and trade connections with China than with Russia, and therefore Russia could be viewed as a more strategically more suitable target for criticism, and this could extend to the Arctic as well. So we would probably see, and this was also mentioned by Ambassador Bolton, we would see further criticism of Russian military buildup, and it's explicitly evident from the Biden's environmental plan. We may see continued increase of security tensions and the military exercises in the High North. We may hear aggressive rhetoric and mutual accusations in militarizing the region. So that was what I expect from the new administration in the Arctic. Now I will shortly speak on what I would like to see in the Arctic under Biden's administration, and you could take it as my humble recommendations. I hope that despite geopolitical tensions, the common sense will prevail, and that the countries will continue collaboration on addressing the growing challenges in the region that could not be tackled by countries separately. So there are plenty of issues that Russia and the US could and should find common ground on, both in the Arctic Council and bilaterally. Green shipping, reduction of black carbon, problems stemming from permafrost melting, management of the Bering Strait region, you name it. But my particular hope is that the two countries would be able to resolve one important problem, not to resolve, but at least to mitigate a problem related to the military field that could potentially impact any other area of interaction in a very bad way. despite the fact that the level of potential conflict in the Arctic region has remained low, the spillover effect from the Ukrainian crisis was the loss of trust between Russia and the Western Arctic nations. One of the implications was the suspension of the existing military dialogue platforms that included Russia. This refers to the Arctic Security Roundtable, meetings of defense ministers and chiefs of general staff. So the Arctic Coast Guard Forum remains the only format with all 8 Arctic states present, but it doesn't cover hard security issues. As a result, the lack of dialogue led to increase of mutual suspicions in the region. So the first step to restore trust and release the tensions should be the decision to sit down at the table again and to start a constructive dialogue on the problems and concerns that each party has today. I think that the change of administration in the US is a great opportunity to take a fresh look at the situation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andre. Much to think about there, and a number of things to come back, and other issues to come back to. I really appreciate that. Next, let me turn the floor over to Ambassador Marianne Conics. Marianne, the floor is yours.
It's okay. Do you hear me? Do you hear me? Okay. Welcome back, America. I would like to touch upon 3 points, and the first point is exactly what do we expect from the US after the elections on the Arctic policy. Very shortly, I will touch upon its impact on the EU Arctic policy, which for the moment we are redrafting, and a very short word to finalize on the impact of EU-US relations in general of the elections. In the first place, and it has been mentioned, and I think it will be mentioned several times during this discussion, that the most positive implications that we see for the Arctic and in general for the US after the elections is the renewed focus on climate change. The President-elect Biden has said that climate change is a foreign policy priority, and we believe that it needs less to say that addressing climate is absolutely key globally, but particularly because of its impact on the Arctic itself. With John Kerry, the US envoy, there will be a renewed focus. It's guaranteed. So he gave an extremely impressive speech last year at the Arctic Circle Assembly, and I would say that it's music to the ears of everybody who cares about the climate, and particularly the European Union. And why the European Union? Why we are a leader on the fight against climate change. We have adopted an extremely ambitious EU Green Deal, and in this Green Deal, a part of the pillar of the Green Deal is to work very closely together with other partners. And there we see that with this new government, that the US will be a very powerful partner to push the climate action program forwards. And with this focus on climate, it also will have impact on we hope, on the US policy regarding sustainable development in the Arctic, and particularly the increased economic activities like drilling and mining. And we are confident that there will be more a focus on the sustainability, on climate friendly investments, on the use of renewable and the use of green energy. So these are all very positive, and we see this very positive because it will be climate and sustainability first, and not anymore what, for example, was the case and which has been mentioned when we had the Rovaniemi Arctic Council meeting, where there were very disturbing statements made by Secretary of State Pompeo, which really were disrupting the Arctic spirit. So we hope that the Arctic spirit will come back and will be guaranteed. Maybe a question, if we are expecting a more active stand of the US on the Arctic. And here, giving an impression from the outside is that while there is other Arctic and non-Arctic countries are increasingly engaging on the Arctic, from the outside it's seen that the US has been the least engaging. If you, for example, look at particularly the last months, the number of Arctic policies or adapting Arctic policies from major Arctic states have been adopted, it's not the case with the US. And we have the impression that the US there has a kind of catching up. The US does not have a comprehensive Arctic policy. You have a kind of fragmentations with different departments we would recommend to have this kind of comprehensive policy, which might address all kinds of issues, like, for example, the lack of infrastructure in the Arctic. We think that every credible Arctic state with the power of the US need adequate equipment infrastructure. Is not only important for military security reasons, but particularly for the people living in the Arctic. And a more strategic vision might also be a driving where still climate change might be the driving factor. It's important to take into development these geopolitical and security developments. I think it's necessary also to have a clear stand of the US on that, given exactly of the more activities of China and the military presence of Russia. The same thing with economic developments. The US is such an important economic power, an energy provider. And if you see all the energy developments which are taking place and resource developments, so this cannot be ignored. And it would be good to know where the US stand on that. It might be needed to update the national strategy for the Arctic region, which the Obama administration had in 2013. But I mean, I don't want to go so far as to recommend something to the US. But in any case, I will say that we believe that the stand of the new administration will be a greater focus on partnerships and cooperation. And there we know that we are in this club of really allies who wants to work together. As I said, this new administration is a perfect timing for the EU when we are drafting now an updated or a new Arctic policy. Our Arctic policy dates from 2016. We want to draft a new one in 2021. And although there will be new elements to invest in the Arctic policy, we did a very, very large consultative consultation process. Whatever the new elements might be, the three key pillars of our Arctic policy will remain. In any case, there's fighting climate change, protecting the environment, secondly, sustainable development, and third, international cooperation. And it's particularly with the third pillar, I think we can work with the US in all the pillars, but particularly, again, promoting international cooperation. We see in the US a very strong partner. And I personally hope the EU has so many already dialogues with the US, ongoing dialogues with the US on energy. Now they just created a dialogue on China. Why not having an EU-US dialogue on the Arctic? And my last point is the stand of EU-US relations after the elections. It's well known. The victory of Joe Biden has been extremely warmly welcomed in Europe, and President-elect has assured that he will be working with allies on a true partnership. And we want to see and seize the opportunities to rebuild the EU cooperation. There are many areas on which EU-US cooperation is very close, particularly now with the pandemic. We can then work together. We welcome that the US is regaining the multilateralism, going back Paris Agreement on Climate, World Health Organization, the Iran nuclear deal. We welcome also the intention to pursue a constructive stance on bilateral trade issues, which has been extremely most contentious in the last four years. And we just made the progress. I was reading that we just reached an agreement on a lobster deal of reducing tariffs for lobsters. So it's the first positive result already. And we also, we hope and foresee that there will be a closer cooperation with China, where we believe that both the US and the European Union have shared concern regarding trade practices, security, and other issues. And very final point, with the new leadership ready to restore a partnership, we believe that the European Union also will have to step up its contributions, and particularly in the security sector when it comes to NATO and transatlantic security alliance. Europe will have to take part more of its responsibilities on its own security. We need more Europe economic strategic autonomy, and we believe that if you have a stronger and capable Europe, it's the best partner for the US, and it's also something with the European Union will need also. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that excellent synopsis from a number of perspectives. We will revisit several of those, and that's the first time in any of these Zoom meetings and conferences in the last 9 months anyone has brought up lobster diplomacy. So thank you very much, Ambassador, for that. So let's move on now to our colleague, Dr. Ulf Sverdrup. Ulf, I will turn over the floor to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. Can you hear me?
Can hear you fine.
Okay, thank you so much for this invitation. Great to be with you. I'll concentrate myself on 3 to 4 specific points. Some of them have been touched upon by David, Andre, and Marianne, but I still think they are from a slightly different angle, and I might add a few things to the discussion. First, let me start with the obvious point. You know, in politics, time and attention is a scarce resource. And God, we have spent a lot of attention on the US election itself. So by just getting rid of that election is just a massive freeing of energy and attention and reduced uncertainty. So it means that we can move on and discuss other topics. And the rest of the world, you might have breathed a sigh of relief when Trump was not re-elected. But at the same time, I think that it's also a fair assessment to say that Trump has not been so influential in fully changing US policy in the Arctic. So compared to other regions, etc., it's been much more continuity to US foreign policy rather than a change to it, I think it's fair to say. At the same time, let me also say that the US election seen from Norway and from the Nordic countries has also demonstrated a country that is very split, polarized and divided, not only in its domestic policy, but increasingly also in its foreign policy. So I think that this election has also made Europeans a bit more concerned about what will happen in 4 years' time. Where will the US be in the longer run? So Europeans in general are recognizing that we have to wake up, do a bit more policy making ourselves, and also to try to be a good partner with the US. And also that we don't have much time to waste. We have to get to the work right away. So that's my first point. So you should expect a positive cooperative spirit from day one from the Europeans. And the Europeans might be more active in suggesting the agenda as well and supporting the administration. And second point, this relates to the point made by David. I think it's very important. The main driver for change in the Arctic is not geopolitical tensions, it's climate change. And global greenhouse gas emissions, not the regional activities, are driving the change. But we also know that the implications of the changes in the Arctic and the melting of the ice cap will have huge global implications far beyond the region, not only the melting of the permafrost that Andre brought up, but also massive global changes. So to me, it seems that the Biden administration will be committed to really drive a green shift. And they might also drive markets, technologies, and other countries with them, take on the leadership. So the reduction of climate emissions, the investing in innovation, research and technologies is probably the most important contribution to the new by the new US administration to on the Arctic, even if it doesn't even mention Arctic by a word. I also might add that nominating John Kerry in this position will give not only strengthened climate dimension, but he has also dedicated many years of his political life to protecting oceans and to ocean governance. So I think that in itself is an independent point, because the Arctic is very much about the oceans. So the third aspect relates to the issue of governance. The Arctic is peaceful, and lots of research from all over the countries have demonstrated there are some key factors that has been important in supporting and creating this rather amicable atmosphere in the Arctic, and that relates to the adherence to the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, active participation in Arctic political institutions, development of regional specific agreements, and last but not least, I think this is extremely important, science cooperation and a strong science-based and knowledge-based foundation for politics. And these principles, I think, are also very much at the core of Norwegian Arctic policy, also of the Nordic countries in general. And to me, it seems that the new US administration with Biden will be committed to both the multilateral thing, to the regional agreements, and not least, he will put an emphasis on science. So this idea that you can have truth, that you can have trust, and that you can have transparency, I think there are key aspects of sound and sustainable governance in the Arctic. And we need this now, because as Marianne touched upon, we are at a stage in development where we might see a rather rapid development of technologies related to identifying, monitoring, exploiting ocean resources, everything from bioprospecting, deep sea mining, but also space technologies and communication technologies. And all of these things will also unfold themselves, and they probably need to have some kind of regulatory regime related to it. And towards the end, Mike, if you allow me, let me say a few words about security as well. We have to keep in mind that, at least this is my approach, that Arctic security is very much depend on how various key states view the strategic importance of the Arctic. So, and at the same time, Arctic security is very much a byproduct of tensions elsewhere. So Andre touched upon Ukraine, and that might spill into the Arctic. Or it could be China rivalry that is spilled out and happening, unfolding in the Arctic. So I think we will continue to face both a more demanding security dynamics between the actors in the Arctic, and we face a more demanding geopolitical dynamics between Arctic and non-Arctic states. So we have to manage this risk of kind of tensions elsewhere spilling over into the Arctic. But if you look at more traditional security, there's no doubt that increased importance of the Arctic for Russia has also led to increased capabilities and increased activity on the Russian side. We also have observed slight increase of interest from the Chinese in the Arctic. And under President Trump, I believe the US also intensified its awareness of the strategic dimension of the Arctic. To some extent, this was attributed to China's increased global ambitions and to Sino-Russian cooperation as well. I believe this will continue, and we should also not forget that Arctic is also an important arena for hybrid challenges. space, missiles, as I said, but also data cables and communications. And it's a very vulnerable environment. You can basically shut off civilizations very rapidly by just turning off electricity. So for Norway and the other Nordic countries, it's important to assert sovereignty, exercise authority, and understand the situation in the north. From our side, we have strengthened our presence through investments in strategic capabilities, the F-35 fighter jets and P-8 patrol aircraft and submarines, etc. But for Norway, NATO is also very important. And NATO should continue its plan, I think, for the defense of the region. And I believe the Nordics will work closely with the US and other Europeans in doing this. And in particular, I think we will welcome a policy that balances between deterrence and dialogue. And hopefully also a policy where we can continue a policy that is predictable, that avoid the risk of unwanted escalation and accidents. There's also always this risk of escalations coming out of some kind of crisis or unwanted, uncontrolled situation. So to sum up, Mike, I think 4 points. It will free a lot of attention. It's a sigh of relief for Europeans, but still a split country. We have to see what will happen in the long run. It will increase our ability to fight climate change. It will stress further the importance of international rules and norms, strengthen science, we believe, and it will perhaps also be a bit more predictable US on the military side. And I think if this is the case, these are all elements that will be welcomed by Norway and the Nordics. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very, very much. I was frantically taking notes there. So you've done well in covering many of the issues that I think are important, and I thank you for your insights.
Thanks.
Finally, Dr. Heather Exner-Perot. Heather, last but certainly not least, would you please share your perspectives from a Canadian insight?
Sure. Thank you, Mike. And again, thanks for having me here. So I'm going to start off where we left off with the Biden administration in Canada. It's almost exactly 4 years ago that then Vice President Biden made his last foreign official visit was to Canada, to Ottawa, in December 2016 to talk about climate change. And soon after he left, it was issued one of the very last official foreign policy actions of the Obama administration was a joint Arctic leader statement between the United States and Canada. And this infamously, in some parts of Canada, included a moratorium on oil and gas, offshore oil and gas drilling, and also a moratorium on the American side. Why I bring that up is because it seemed very clear from a northern perspective in Canada that they're good friends, they're famous friends. Obama and Biden asked them to do something, and they did it unilaterally without any consultation on Northerners, because I think Obama and Biden wanted to make their last imprint on climate change. And since that, that was a real sore point that this was announced, kind of by Ottawa without any consultation, just as the Trudeau government was starting their co-development, they called it co-development process for the Arctic Northern Policy Framework. So one thing I would have concerns about is that with the Biden administration back in, that it may appeal to kind of the most basic instincts or tendencies of the Liberal government in Ottawa, is to focus more on their international standing and their international friends rather than the interests of Northerners, at least consulting with them. So I think we might see that. I think for America, the Arctic has always been more about the ocean and climate change than it has for Canada. For Canada, there's been a lot more focus on kind of the human dimension of Northerners, Indigenous people, self-determination. And so I think we might see a tendency with the new Biden administration for Trudeau to lean more again towards that climate change when he thinks of the Arctic. So that's one issue. The second issue is what is the fallout from the Trump administration? And Ambassador Conics referenced this terrible Pompeo speech on the eve of the Finnish Arctic Council ministerial. And in that speech, Pompeo actually called Canada's claims to the Northwest Passage illegitimate. And so that was obviously very disconcerting. And I will say the highest tension in the Arctic in the last 3 years, I think you could easily make the argument, was actually on American threats to do freedom of navigation operations in Canada and Russia, where that might have actually turned into, some kind of tension or conflict. And I think what we're all thinking now outside the United States is, there's definitely relief that Trump is gone and Biden is coming in, but the American electorate is the same. And so we might be able to trust Biden more than Trump, but can you trust them for more than 4 years or 8 years or 12 years? In fact, it may be very well Trump that wins again and is back in office in 4 years. And so as Anne-Marie said, we are all looking for more strategic security autonomy. And I think in one hand, that's exactly what many Republican and conservative American voters and politicians would want, is that everyone else is going to pick up some of their own slack and lead a little bit more for themselves rather than depending on the United States. But on the other hand, I think we're just seeing this hastening of what was a bipolar moment in the Cold War to a unipolar moment in the 90s, and now really a multipolar moment that I think we are going to continue down the slide towards more multipolarity. And that has impacts in the Arctic, which has often been seen as kind of east-west and kind of Russia against the rest. And I'm wondering if we'll start to see some more multipolarity in Arctic relations also. Not kind of a consolidated West as maybe it once was. Which leads me to my last point, is what are the impacts of this new Biden administration going to be on regional relations? And I think from my own perspective, and I think most people would agree, it's been a low point in Arctic relations, not because there was lots of tension or conflict, but because not much has been happening. Pretty much for the last kind of exciting or ambitious thing to happen, I think, was the fisheries agreement in the Central Arctic Ocean. We didn't even have an Arctic Council declaration. A lot has been just put on hold for the last 2 years, I think, to see what would happen with the United States. And so now this question is, can people be more ambitious with the Russian Arctic Council chairmanship? Can we be more ambitious and do some things in 4 years? And also, I think with that thought in mind of what's going to happen in 4 years. And should we be preparing and setting any kind of platforms or frameworks in the Arctic now to insulate against the possibility of another Trump-like presidency in 4 years' time? So lots of questions, and we'll see how everything plays out. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather, very much. Well, I certainly have a number of questions and follow-up themes to offer. I will tell you that we're working on somewhere north of a couple of dozen questions already, some of them multi-part questions. So I'm going to do my very best now to bring in our global audience and work through the panel. In some particular order, this particularly for Andre and for Dave. Question is, what U.S. and international action do you expect or hope to see in the Bering Strait area? What do you think are the top priorities there? And I offer that up to you both because we have talked about both competition and cooperation and the relationship between the Russian Federation and the United States. Thoughts?
Andre, do you wish to go first? No, you want me to go first? Okay. Well, one obvious thing about the Bering Strait is it has already seen an increase, modest increase in shipping, an increase that's almost certainly, is likely an event to accelerate. There have been some measures already put in place to manage such shipping more effectively to ensure against accidents and spills and conflicts. So for example, Russia and the United States jointly went to the International Maritime Organization and proposed a voluntary traffic separation scheme that is now in place. But that was, in my view, at least only a first step. There are a number of other things that need to be done to build on that. The US and Russia have developed, about to sign, a joint contingency plan for oil pollution in the area. That's another good step, again, needs to be built on. There need to be some areas to be avoided, particularly in the northern part of the Bering Strait. So there's the whole shipping regime to strengthen. I'd hope that what momentum has built up over the last few years can continue in that respect. There was also an incident recently in which Russian military exercises surprised some American fishing vessels on the US side of the maritime boundary line. And it made me think that we need to have more effective kinds of communication, so at least there is not inadvertent conflict caused by simply not knowing what the other side is doing in that respect. So both in the Bering Sea and more broadly, I was hoping that there could be some resumption of military to military communication, at least, to avoid unnecessary conflict. This is something some of the other speakers already addressed. Andre, what do you think?
I totally agree with you, Dave. I think that actually the joint separation scheme that was adopted by IMO and proposed by USA and Russia was a very good example of how two states can cooperate despite the geopolitical tensions and regional tensions in the Arctic. I know that a lot of experts call, despite that there are some progress in the Bering Strait region, I know that a lot of experts and indigenous people, local communities that live there in the Bering Strait region call for more measures to manage shipping, first of all, because shipping is a most rapidly increasing activity in the Arctic. And I know that there is a whole bunch of instruments proposed: ship routing systems, vessel traffic management services, MPAs, areas to be avoided. We know that there are some areas to be avoided in the Bering Strait, but only on the US side. So probably creation, adoption, and designation of such areas from the Russian side would be, of course, welcomed by every stakeholder. I think that in the short term, what we could do is to assess each of the proposed measures in terms of what could be, what is justified to adopt right now and what is not. For example, I know that some Russian and American experts believe that a vessel traffic system will be hard to justify because it's very expensive and for the current low level of shipping, relatively low shipping in the area. But for example, areas to be avoided could be a good example of what we can do now.
Thank you, Andre. Ulf, I have a question for you specific to NATO. Under perhaps a new Biden administration, or what are your thoughts about how a Biden administration should approach NATO? Specifically, what are your expectations for the region with regard to NATO, and how might NATO change its posture vis-a-vis a US influence into NATO?
First of all, I think that the President Trump and the administration, of course, in reality, demonstrated a policy of being committed to NATO. But at the same time, it left a fundamental uncertainty about the long-term kind of commitment to NATO, and also it triggered somehow a split and division within European countries in how to relate also to the US. And I think for how NATO will develop is partly, of course, it's dependent upon a firm and long-term commitment by the US to NATO. I think the Biden administration will do that, but it will also require commitment by the Europeans to engage in burden sharing, and also to help to continue to build the transatlantic relations with Canada and with the US. And I think Europeans, Trump triggered a reflection in Europe about what is called the European strategic autonomy. This idea that Europe will have to do more by themselves. But this European strategic autonomy or European sovereignty is an enduring theme. in European integration, and it's been contested because some have perceived this notion about European sovereignty as something that is different from transatlantic cooperation. Others see it as a necessary coordination in order to be a more credible partner to the US. And I think Biden will follow the latter stance. He will somehow say, yes, we are committed to transatlantic cooperation, but Europe should also continue its process of being a more coordinated actor. So European strategic autonomy will be, it's not European sovereignty or European differentiation from the US, but it will be a more coordinated Europe that will be a stronger partner to the US. I think that's the direction. And this is, of course, means also that NATO policy will be slightly more coordinated with EU policy, I believe. Of course, some of the military aspects will be within the scope of NATO, but there are also lots of issues related to, not necessarily so important for the Arctic, such as migration, cyber, all kinds of other economic aspects, sanctions, etc. Those will be governed by EU issues. So I think the US administration, the new US administration, will take a very different way of thinking about Europe. It will not be only the capitals, it will be Brussels, and it will be like what the US was before, in some sense, the US pushing for a more coordinated Europe. I think this is, so it will be a EU and NATO coordination policy. I think how this will play out in the Arctic, I think is, as of now, the EU, sorry to say, Marianne, but the EU is not a very active player in the Arctic. Of course, the EU, some EU countries are part of are part of the Arctic, right? But there are also a lot of them. So, and the EU as a regulatory space is a regulatory actor, is coordinating a lot of activities, economic policies, etc., and also in research. It's very important. But it's not having a seat at the table at the Arctic Council, and I don't see that will happen either. But Marianne might want to touch upon this.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much, because you've opened up a line here that I would like to explore, but I want to give Marianne an opportunity to respond to Ulf's comments.
First of all, I would say that I totally disagree what Ulf said, just that we are not an important player. And one of the reasons is that the European Union is an Arctic entity. Yes, it is an Arctic entity when, and I have said this at a previous conference, when Senator Malkowski from Alaska says that the US is an Arctic state because of Alaska, we say we are an Arctic entity. And we are not only, it's part of our territory, but we're doing enormously in the Arctic with our programs, with our policies. The very high norms apply and standards apply to activities. And when I speak about European Arctic, I always include Iceland and Norway, because they are part also of the economic zone, and they are applying exactly the same standards. So we are doing a lot. And about a seat at the Arctic Council. You know, the whole discussion about EU's observership, but now I'm speaking on a personal opinion. There's a whole discussion on, we get lots of support. European Union should get a formal observership at the Arctic Council. Now, we are de facto, and we're doing exactly the same thing as if we were a formal observer. But what would it bring to be a formal observer? Would bring it more to the European Union. And the question that I have been asking is, should it not be normal, being an Arctic entity, that we should be at the table? My personal opinion is the European Union should be at the table of the Arctic Council. I want to say a word about NATO. When you read also recent national Arctic policies, the most recent one, Sweden, a very big focus also on security. But I will take the example also of the German Arctic policy, which a big focus on scientific cooperation, and no wonder also with the Mosaic expedition. But the German Arctic strategy explicitly calls for greater engagement of NATO and the European Union on security matters. And the European Union has a global security strategy in which we plead with regarding to the Arctic to have more also cooperation, political and security cooperation. So I think there is absolutely scope for the European to do more. And I just want to refer, when you speak about the security issues, I will never forget that the Finnish previous Minister of Foreign Affairs said, you cannot put a do not disturb sign on the Arctic. And what you mentioned, Ulf, is the big risk of spillovers, of tensions outside. And then I want to just say that I agree with André, and I'm pleased to see André because we have been in several conferences together, and there is actually a lack of dialogue on security matters. And by not having this dialogue and communication is a risk in itself. And I think that this solution should be found where also, without creating new institutions, there should be somewhere a body where also these security issues should be discussed.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank everyone who is sending in questions. We have many of them, and we're getting to them. We're actually responding to some of them before I even have to ask the question. So thank you. But let me ask you to all of you perhaps to respond to this statement. It seems that each of you have talked about the need for maybe a different posture from the US, right? More multilateral, more bilateral engagement, reinforcement of the rules of law, international organizations from the Arctic Council to the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. So react to this. It seems to me in a very interesting way that for a Biden administration, one thing that they must think about or should think about is confidence building measures with our traditional allies, which is not really something that we think about often, at least in the United States. We think about confidence building with those that we may not be, like-minded with. But it seems like we're teasing out here, whether it be the Transatlantic Alliance or Circumpolar, is that there might be a need for this administration to really take a hard look and focus on confidence building measures, perhaps using the Arctic as one tool to patch up relationships and to advance these relationships for the betterment of the Arctic region. Anyone want to respond to that? Heather, I kind of teased that one out after yours. Sure, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, if I were the United States, I would focus on your own internal house yet, build some confidence internally, because the problem from my perspective isn't that you need to go out and do work and fix, it's that it may happen again, so you can build as much confidence as you want for this 4-year term, but everyone is thinking about 2024 and 2028. So what do you need to do in your own house to build confidence that there can be consistency in your foreign policy? And I will, for me, it's not a liberal conservative problem, because if I think back in the history of Canadian and American bilateral relations, Reagan and Mulroney got a lot done and actually had that 1988 cooperation agreement that kind of agreed to disagree on the Northwest Passage. It's a very elegant foreign policy solution and has served us well in those 30 years. And so it's not that, conservatives can't do foreign policy. It's that the United States in this polarized moment, Biden can't assure us what the other half of the House is going to do in 4 years. And that's where the uncertainty comes from, I think. So how can, things such as ratifying agreements like UNCLOS, you can't ratify UNCLOS right What other things can't you do? So I would focus on what you can do internally, and then we'll all see, oh, they have their act together. We can be certain that what American foreign policy is today will be the same foreign policy in 5 years.
Dave, please. Thank you, Heather.
Thanks. Well, Heather is certainly right that the Biden administration would do well to look internally first and build confidence in our allies and partners that things that may be put in place in the coming years are likely to stay in place. Of course, what she's describing as a feature of modern democracies generally, that regimes change through the vote. It wasn't so long ago that there was a Harper administration in Canada that had very different approaches to certain issues, including in the Arctic. And Canada and any of the other Arctic countries, at least that follow democratic norms, may change leadership as well and change policies as a result. What's dismaying to me is to think that we're already having to think about 2024. And a new administration taking office in 2025. I think there are things, Mike, that we can do in the coming year to build confidence, including with the Trudeau administration. Things got pretty frosty pretty quickly after President Trump took office. And there ought to be things that a new Biden administration can do to reassure both the Trudeau administration, people in Canada more generally, that we are looking for more cooperation and less friction. And some of those things could be right in the Arctic.
Thank you. Ulf, please.
Very rapidly. I think that in terms of confidence building, I think the problem is not confidence among allies, Mike, because the US and the Trump, they did a lot to increase the military. They, as I said, they brought up Arctic as a more kind of strategic importance of it, and they allocated more resources and also started to do more exercising, etc., in the Arctic. But for allies, the confidence building is not so much about on the security dimension, but on, as I alluded to, it's more on the trust in science, the importance of science, and the trust in institutions, etc. Exactly what Marianne brought up as well, right? So so that is something that the US need to build confidence in, those spheres. Now, when it comes to non-allies countries, I think that it's a fact that there will be more military activity and more military exercises in the Arctic. So we have to prepare ourselves for a more military presence in the region. And then the question about confidence building is about having good and clear and transparent rules for engagement, information system for about exercising, and also how to avoid incidents and preparedness if accidents were to happen. And I think that is a very important confidence building measure that the US should engage in. But of course, this is not only about the US, it's also about Russia and also about all the other actors, also to make it clear, okay, nobody can come and say that there's uncertainty about the rules, about exercising, information exchange, etc. So if there is uncertainty, the parties like David and Mike and you others brought up, maybe we should establish some kind of track 2 dialogue, 1.5, etc., to make sure that those rules of engagement and rules of exchange, we shouldn't allow that to be unclear.
Thank you, Ulf. Andre, please. And then I have a follow-up question for Andre, and I have a follow-up question for Marianne as well.
Yeah, thanks. I totally agree with Ulf, and I would add that I think that in the Arctic region there is a quite distorted understanding of what allies and partners are actually. So if we talk about allies in geopolitical, I mean allies of USA in geopolitical sense, it's one number of countries, and The Arctic is quite different because I think that all Arctic states and all non-Arctic states that at least are observers in the Arctic Council are all committed to the same principles and the same rules. There has been mentioned a lot of times, even today, that USA is not a party to UNCLOS, for example, but it's a fact that USA acknowledge a bulk of the most provisions of the UNCLOS as common law provisions. So it is committed to UNCLOS in the Arctic, and I think confidence building measures in the Arctic, it's really it means a shared vision of what we should do in future next. I think I mentioned it in my introduction commentary that Biden administration, his vision of environment and climate change brings US closer to the other Arctic nations. That is a very good confidence building measure. But security is also very important, and as I already mentioned, dialogue platforms should be restored, reestablished, and that's a very that's vitally important.
Thank you. And Andre, the issue of military to military discussion is something you brought up, Ulf alluded to. Can you give me, in a couple of sentences or more if you need, how might that be received by the Russian Federation? A circumpolar meeting as you discussed, or a forum as you discussed, or resurrecting the old forums post 2014?
I think that most experts believe that the existing platforms in the Arctic could suffice if Russia would be reintroduced into these platforms. For example, Arctic Security Roundtable, which was established in I don't remember when, but not very, it was less than 10 years ago. And after 2014, it was, so Russian participation was suspended. And I think that's one of the options. We had also meetings of Minister of Defenses and General Staff. But I know that the present geopolitical situation is that the leadership may not be ready to do this right now. And I heard some other options from experts that focus more on track 2 diplomacy. For example, convening some kind of establishing some kind of academic roundtable in which military officials would participate, but not so in their personal capacities, not professional capacities, so that at least they could have informal dialogue on what problems and concerns they have.
Thank you. Marianne, I have a number of questions about the importance, and this has been raised here, the importance of science diplomacy as a counter to all of the narrative about hard security in the North, or tensions in the North. So practically, we need more, obviously more research in the Arctic, but also as a tool for these confidence building measures, but a way to leverage what Andre has said, which is we have more in common than we don't. Do you want to speak to that? Because I probably have 8 or 9 questions related to the role, EU's role in helping to facilitate science diplomacy in the Arctic. You're on mute, as I was. I apologize.
I'm mute, okay. I would say that science diplomacy is already a fact in dealing with the Arctic. I remember, and it was the US who took the initiative to have the first science minister, the Arctic Science Ministerial, which took place in Washington. And the second one was organized by the European Union, Germany and Finland together in 2018. And it was praised by everybody for different reasons. One key reason that it brought together the ministers, the politicians. It brought together also the permanent participants, the indigenous people, because the traditional knowledge plays a role, and it brought together the scientists. And I will never forget the speech that the European Commissioner, who was representing the European Union, was giving there. It was all focused on science diplomacy, the key role that science plays for taking decisions which are needed in the field of addressing all the challenges for the Arctic. And if you look at our program, we have, I think we have one of the world's biggest research programs on Arctic research. All our programs are, you need to have the participants of different countries. They are networking. And we have, for example, many of our programs where we have participants from China, from Russia, and they work extremely very well. They work extremely very well together. So I think science play a key role, also as science diplomacy. I don't think that among the researchers, it doesn't matter from which country they are coming. But just to pick up on confidence building measures, the European Union has a lot of clouds in the relationship with Russia. But where we work well together with Russia is on the Arctic, is on what we call also our Northern Dimension policy. We work since more than 20 years. We have cross-border projects. We have concrete projects for addressing some of the environmental problems, addressing black carbon. And we had last week, for the first time, we had a European Union, Russia conference on climate change. So, I mean, it works very well. And it's very welcomed by the European Union. And I personally hope that we also might enlarge that. But this is, of course, a political decision.
Thank you. Heather, I'd like to put you on a spot in a good way as a colleague. Can you speak a little bit about what you might like to see the Biden administration do in terms of the subnational dynamics in the Arctic? And specifically Alaska, Northern Canada, Greenland, and perhaps even Iceland. You know, we tend to think of our work, or many people think of our work as north to south, but there is this east-west issue where we have a lot in common. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought it up, because I was thinking, you know, whereas the federal government foreign policy might be a little more in flux, I think we can, you know, understand what Northwest Territories' interests are in the long term, or Alaska's interests are in the long term, or Greenland's in the long term. And so it's easier to find areas of collaboration there. And just building on Marianne's point about science diplomacy, I think also that sub-regional diplomacy is also very important. And as a corollary of that, private industry diplomacy, you know, that business interests across these sub-nations also are able to have a platform to collaborate. So what can we do to strengthen that? And we thought about this in Canada a lot with the Arctic Northern Policy Forum, is just to build those bridges. I think having a consulate in Greenland is a very positive thing, you know, maybe the most positive thing to come out of the Trump administration. And in as much as that can build Alaska relations, I think Canada should have a consulate in Alaska that could build some of those business relations, resource development, but also collaboration on the infrastructure and the innovation that you need that is specific to cold and extreme temperatures and sparse populations and long distances. And so I really think kind of the innovation agenda, providing good public services that are relevant for Arctic peoples, are affordable for Arctic peoples, and appropriate is where we could be investing more. So it can't just be it's the ocean and climate change. There's a lot of research and innovation and engineering that could be gone into that really has an impact on people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Dave, there's a question here I'd like to pose to you. The question is, what do you think the American diplomatic presence in Greenland will focus on under the new administration?
That's a good question. Well, as I said at the outset, I don't think the trajectory of the evolving U.S. relationship with Greenland is likely to change very much from the Trump to the Biden administration. I think I regard it as positive. I agree with that this was a positive development that took place under the Trump administration. Greenland within the Kingdom of Denmark is gaining greater degrees of autonomy, in some ways is gravitating, if only very slowly, closer to North America, if I could say that. The consulate in Nuuk, which is a very small staff, nevertheless has the ability to allow for direct engagement with the Greenlandic government and through them with the Greenlandic people. And I see that as both politically useful, but also symbolically important. We are wanting to help support Greenland as appropriate without getting crosswise with people in Copenhagen in their ambitions, and the new consulate can be sort of a vehicle to help do that.
Thank you. This question I'd like to pose to Andre and Ulf, and others please weigh in as well. The question, I'll just read it verbatim here. What will be the role in the new future for regional cooperation like Northern Forum and the Barents Cooperation? In other words, what would you think the emerging roles are in the future Arctic for both of those entities? Ulf, do you want to take at that?
Yeah, so it's a bit unclear what this means, but it's Nordic cooperation. Is it the Nordic cooperation among the Nordic countries or Northern? It's a bit unclear for me. But
yeah, what will be the future role in the new future for regional cooperation?
Okay, I lost you, Mike. Okay, I can say a few things. First, I think the cooperation, the Barents cooperation between Russia and Norway is likely to continue. But of course, this has been made a bit more difficult out of geopolitical tensions. But I think Norway and Russia are stuck in a position where we will have to relate to each other. And we will find some way of moving ahead, but at the same time, also we need to. I think Russians are frustrated by the Norwegians, of course, but also Russians have to recognize that Norwegians are frustrated by some of the Russian behavior in the region. So that's one thing. When it comes to Nordic cooperation, I think this relates to what Marianne said as well, that there is a strong. I think that we will experience more regional cooperation in Europe, but also more regional cooperation in the Nordic region. This is because geopolitics is back, and that means that geography is back. So countries that are close to each other will relate more systematically to each other. And also it's related to defense spending, where countries need to invest more in defense. So they have to try to pool resources and to cooperate more. So I'm fairly optimistic in terms of both regional cooperation and also to some extent on Russian-Norwegian cooperation, but it will have to overcome some of the difficulties they are facing now.
So yeah, we have lost Mike momentarily. Maybe I'll just jump in, and I see that Marianne has something she wishes to add. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yes, regarding the Barents Cooperation, there is the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, which exists more than 20 years, where the European Union is a member, together with Russia, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and it works extremely well. When you have ministerial meetings, they make a kind of below what have been realized, and this is one of the success stories. Is the Barents Arctic Cooperation, where you have concrete cooperation between the different regions across the frontiers, Russia with the Northern European countries. So it is functioning despite, and it has not been stopped also after the Ukraine and the sanctions regime. It has been functioning, and it's extremely well received because it's also very closely people-to-people contact and very sub-regional contracts across the board. So extremely positive and successful.
Andre, please, now that I'm back, Dave, thank you for taking over, and colleagues, thank you for running this totally without me. Keep going.
Yeah, I agree that we have a very good record of cooperation in the Barents Sea, but we shouldn't forget that in terms of security, the Barents region has become a very the most tense region, sub-region in the Arctic, because when we speak about security tensions in the Arctic between NATO, USA, and Russia, it mainly deals only with the parent North Atlantic and the Barents Sea region because of different reasons. One of them is that Russia has Russian strategic nuclear forces allocated in the Kola Peninsula in the Barents Sea region, and NATO's forces are also, one of the tasks is to patrol the North Atlantic. So we have this friction zone between different countries there, and I think that the military exercises in the Barents Sea zone will continue under Biden administration, and we may expect some tensions there also. So notwithstanding that, the cooperation still goes on and continues.
Thank you. We have about 4 minutes left or so. I'm regaining some of the questions, but we have limited time. And because all of us know each other in the North, I'm also getting questions on both of my cell phones, which is just perfect this way. But a question to all the panelists, actually. It's about the future of the Arctic Council and its work on climate. And specifically from an Alaskan colleague, want to know what specific things do you think the Arctic Council will have on tap for climate change work? And secondly, do you think that the 8 Arctic nations will decide in some manner what Alaska or Northern Canada or any resource-rich area in the North can produce or develop? And I just open that to the panel.
I'll
I saw
start.
Heather.
Yeah, I hate to usurp Dave on Arctic Council question, but on climate change, I think whatever the Arctic Council does, it has to be more visible on climate change. And that is one thing, obviously, that will be easier under a Biden administration. And, you know, black carbon is an obvious one, so I look forward to that. But I'm more interested in the second part of the question, is whether there will ever be constraints on what the Arctic states can do in terms of resource development. And I'm sure Andre would agree with me, and that's 100% no. You know, it's not a common heritage all the way to the 66 parallel. You know, these are state interests. And for Canada, at least, there's almost no oil and gas. It's mostly mining, which we need for a green transition anyway. So it's not nearly as much of an issue, but Canada would never restrict or allow others to restrict what it's, and there may be a constitutional issue. It probably couldn't impose on the Indigenous peoples of Northern Canada what they could do if they do decide to go ahead with resource development.
I agree with Heather. I would just add this. While it's true the Arctic Council has a long history of working in climate issues, and I hope that continues and increases during the next US administration, it's Russia that is taking over the chairmanship. It's not clear to me how much the Russian chair of the chairmanship of the council will want to focus on climate change. Perhaps the answer is yes. That remains to be seen.
Thank you, Heather and Dave. We have about...
Could I just jump in, Mike? Just very briefly. Just as the others said, the Arctic Council is just a consultative body, right? So they don't make binding decisions in that sense. I think, and this relates, so maybe a question to Andre or the comment to Andre. I think the most important thing that Biden can do is basically reduce the demand of oil and gas, right? And increase the cost of exploiting and increase pricing of CO2. So this means that I think that in Norway, at least, companies will be more concerned about investing a lot in exploration of oil and gas in resources, in territories or areas that are far away from the market with considerable uncertainty. So that means that I think that the likelihood of exploiting fossil resources, oil and gas, petroleum, in the Arctic is declining. And partly because of climate change and the green transition, and Biden might speed up that transition. It is interesting to see if that is also going to have impact on the Russian view of exploitation of resources, because in Russia, oil and gas activity in the Arctic is becoming more and more important for their economy, but it's not important for the Norwegian economy, for instance. The regional economy perhaps, but not for the total economy.
Mm.
Well, perhaps on that, that's a good place to wrap this discussion. We've gone 90 minutes. I don't know how many dozens of questions I have not been able to get to. I can tell you that this has been a rich discussion, wonderful insight, a number of messages over my text saying, can you bring this panel back again in January? So perhaps you can expect an email from me wondering if we can do this again, because there are so many issues here that we simply have not gotten to, each covering your areas of expertise. So my deep appreciation to all of you for the first, perhaps, panel on this discussion. Maybe next time we'll have a different set of issues to explore. I think we just hit the tops. We drilled a little bit down. No pun intended. I would remind those that are watching that there's a full week of Polar Institute programs that are respective from US scholars, but maybe we do have another one of these programs. I cannot, again, thank you enough for participating today. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to the over 600 people that registered for this. I very much appreciate it. Have a good morning, afternoon, and good evening. And once again, thank you to colleagues. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you.